Well, we've been talking these tax cuts today and how important it is for the Trump administration and the country and middle-class Americans to get this tax cut. It's going to the Senate, hopefully be voted on next week so we can get reconciliation, get to the president's desk by Christmas so we can get this economy growing and booming and great again. Joining us now, Kevin Hassett. Kevin is the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors in the White House. He was confirmed by the United States Senate on September 12th and sworn in as the 29th chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors on September 13th. Prior to becoming chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors in the White House, Kevin Hassett was an economist at the American Enterprise Institute since 1997. His most recent titles there included the James Q. Wilson Chair in American Culture and Politics and Director of Research and Domestic Policy. He's man of many titles. He also served as Director of Economic Policy Studies and resident scholar from 2003 to 2014. I could spend my whole 50 minutes with him going over all his accomplishments, but he's chomping at the bit because he wants to talk about the Trump tax cut plan. Joining us now, Chief of the White House Economic Advisors, Kevin Hassett. Great to have you with us, Mr. Hassett.
It's great to be here, and happy Thanksgiving. I'm looking forward to hopping a flight and going to visit my dad tonight. And, it'll be a great week.
Well, thank you so much. And look, thanks for being with us. I know you have a tight schedule today, Kevin, and I appreciate it. I saw you at the White House briefing, and I thought you did a fine job there. And I also got an opportunity to ask you a question. A lot of the debate that we're having on our show right here, where America comes to talk in the morning, is some people are concerned about the rate of growth that we're going to need in order to make up the $1.1 trillion growth in the deficit that some of the think tanks have put out in evaluating this tax cut plan in a static, rather dynamic economy. Kevin, can you expound on that?
Oh, sure. I think that if we look back over the last 8 years, everybody agrees that the economy grew a little bit, not nearly the rate we're used to, and that workers barely got a raise at all. And the interesting thing is that if you look over the last 8 years, something else happened, which was unusual, which is that profits grew about as fast as they've ever grown. And so we've had really, really big increases in profits, but almost no increase in wages. And, we put out a report about a month ago that, dug into why that happened, because it used to be when profits go up, wages go up. And we found that there was a break in the relationship between profits and wages, and that the break happened really maybe it started about 15 years ago, and it happened because we're the highest corporate tax place in the developed world, and all of our big profitable companies are building factories overseas instead of here. And so if they're not making jobs for Americans, then they're not, competing for American workers. They're not, having to give Americans a pay raise. And so this is the thing that President Trump wants to fix. And this is the thing that this tax bill that you just talked about will fix if it becomes law.
So if we get to 4.5% growth, what does that mean in increased revenues over spending that would then have a positive impact on the national debt?
Well, I think that the way to think about it is without actually going into like billions of dollars, which are always confusing, especially in the morning before your third cup of coffee, right?
Right.
Is to think about it this way, that if you look at the score 10 years from now in the Joint Tax Committee score for the tax bill, then it's got revenue lower without accounting for any growth effects by about 0.5% of GDP. There's about 0.5% of GDP less revenue in the 10th year because they're given a middle-class tax cut and cutting the corporate rate. Now, that, of course, doesn't account for growth at all or anything. Mm-hmm. And so then you could ask yourself, well, how much higher does GDP need to be to make it so that we should take that trade? And, tax revenue isn't everything. If GDP were just 0.5% higher, then, Americans would be getting, income equal to the tax that was reduced. That'd be a pretty good thing, right? And if GDP was, a whole percent higher, then we'd be coming out ahead. Our study that we put out about a month ago suggested that GDP would be 3 to 5% higher. And that's, plenty of room to cover the lost revenue of the 10th year.
So you believe that if you are 3 to 5% higher in GDP over what you have been averaging right now, mm-hmm. that increased activity is going to generate revenues to the Treasury that will then offset the static view of a $1.1 trillion increase in the debt.
Yeah, that 1.1 trillion is again over 10 years, so you're only talking 110 billion in the 10th year. And again, if you think about it, in the 10th year, CBO estimates that GDP will be 28 trillion. And so this deficit that everybody's making so much noise about is a tiny, tiny fraction of what we think GDP is going to be 10 years from now. And again, so if you take something that's 28 trillion, you make it 5% higher, that's 1.4 trillion higher. And so forget about revenue. Suppose that you didn't collect any revenue on that. Would you trade, 110 billion in revenue 10 years from now for 1.4 trillion in income for Americans? Is that a trade you would make?
Yes.
Of course, right?
Yes, obviously.
Forget about the revenue. But then, if Americans had 1.4 trillion more in income, then we'd get about 20% of that in revenue, and that's why the numbers work out in the end. And so, I looked back at this before I came into the White House and just looked at the history of the attitudes of, today's opposition party towards the deficit. And it's really pretty striking that they tend to be really, really budget hawks when they're in opposition.
Right.
But, not when they're in power. And you might even recall that right before the last election, all the Democratic economists were saying that we needed to spend, another $1 trillion on stimulus because the economy was growing so slowly.
Right.
And then as soon as President Trump wins, then all of a sudden this, 110 billion in the 10th year is going to lead to a catastrophe. And so I think it doesn't make sense economically. And if you look at just the changing political tides, I think you can understand where those arguments are coming from.
Well, I think you nailed it right there. You're on the John Fredericks Radio Network, where America comes to talk in the morning. We're with Kevin Hassett, and Kevin is the chairman of the White House Council on Economic Advisors. Kevin, the opposition, as you call, and many other people have been saying that this is a tax cut for the rich. I mean, I go on CNN 3 times a week, and it's the same argument. Tax cut for the rich. There's a loophole for private jets. It's the elimination of the AMT, the alternative minimum tax, and the death tax, and corporate tax is going to go to shareholders. So I'm getting the same argument that this is a tax cut for the rich, yet you look at the numbers, and it doesn't say that. How do you explain that?
Yeah, I think that what's going on is that the opponents of the bill are, trying every argument they could come up with, even arguments that are inconsistent with one another. But, the fact is that let's go back to the example that we were just doing, right? Like, so we get a 1.4 trillion more in income 10 years from now, then who's going to get that income? Well, the evidence is that the people who get that income are the people who, were not getting a job, didn't have a job in the baseline, but do have a job because all the plants are coming home. Or maybe they had a job, but their wage goes up because their boss, bought a bunch of cool new machines because the corporate rate was lower and there was expensing. And, maybe they didn't even have their firm change much, but there are so many new factories in their town that, their boss had to give them a pay raise just to keep the workers that he had. Again, the evidence is really overwhelming that 1.4 trillion goes throughout the income distribution. And the people who say this is just a tax cut for the rich are not looking at the individual side at all, because on that side it is a big middle-class tax cut. They're looking at the corporate side and saying, oh, that's just a giveaway to the rich. But let me tell you, right now we got a tax code where those companies don't pay the tax. They just move the income to Ireland by putting a factory in Ireland and paying the Irish tax. So they don't pay the tax. The rich are already doing great with the current code. If you think that. And what we're doing is just moving towards a world where the rate here is attractive enough that they'll bring their activity back. And that's got to be good for workers.
Mr. Chairman, what do you say to people who say, well, look, this really, I'm kind of in the middle class. I make $100,000, but I itemize. And when I look at giving up my itemization and also for the state income tax, regardless of if I'm in a high tax state or not, I'm actually going to pay more, so it doesn't benefit me, even though I don't really make, I'm not wealthy. I make $130,000, $150,000, but I itemize everything. I'm going to actually pay more. How do you respond to them?
Well, I think that, again, the Joint Tax Committee has put out distributional tables that show that the benefit of having a lower rate outweighs the cost of losing your deduction for almost everybody, for most people. And again, the way to think about it is that suppose that you're paying $10,000 in taxes to the federal government right now, and the way they calculate the $10,000 is they give you a big state and local income tax deduction, but then they charge a pretty high tax rate on whatever's left over. If you stop letting people have the state and local income deduction, then you can charge them a higher rate and collect the same amount of money, right? It's very simple with a lower rate. And what the guys up on the Hill have done is that they've actually designed a plan that for most people you come out ahead because of the lower rate. But the reason why this is really important for economic efficiency is that it has two big economic effects. The first is that if you decide to work overtime, then because you have a lower rate, you're going to get to keep more of that money. And so what we've historically seen is that people work harder and longer voluntarily when they get lower rates, and that's good for the economy. It's good for output. And the second thing is that if we eliminate or put some kind of cap on the state and local income tax deduction, then what it does is it doesn't have the federal government favor states that are irresponsible with high taxes and high spending. And rather, it just gets the government out of that game altogether, and it's neutral. And you're already seeing, some talk, like there was an article in the Wall Street Journal yesterday that New Jersey is thinking again about a big tax increase that they were planning because they're worried that they wouldn't really be able to keep the wealthy people of the state because they'd lose the state and local deduction. And so right now, you can think about it, the federal tax is supporting the high tax states. And if we just go towards neutral, then maybe that'll be good for people all across the country.
Kevin Hassett, the president's position that the federal government shouldn't be in the business of subsidizing high tax states, right? I mean, if you're unhappy with the tax system in New Jersey, either change the government in New Jersey or move out, right? But we shouldn't be in the business of subsidizing that. I live in Virginia. I don't have anything to do with California, New York, or New Jersey. So I don't want to be subsidizing that. And I think you're absolutely spot on with that. Talk about the repeal or getting rid of in the new tax code, the AMT, or the alternative minimum tax. I go on CNN and those that I debate say, well, there it is. This is the benefit to the rich. The AMT was put in there so the people that didn't pay taxes because they took advantage of the loopholes, now they have to pay it no matter what. Define the logic behind getting rid of that.
Well, don't forget that, so the alternative minimum tax is this monstrosity that was put in the tax code really, I guess it was in the late 1960s, if I remember correctly, in part because the story goes that Time magazine or some journal found some little old lady who was rich but paid no tax, and she was rich. She had lots of municipal bond interest income that's not taxable. And then it became the scandal that you can be a millionaire but pay no tax. But as you know, if you have muni bonds, you get a much lower interest rate because of the tax status, right? So they put this alternative minimum tax thing in. And the way it works is that you have to calculate your tax one way, calculate your tax another way. Both of them are big, complex forms. And then you have to pay whichever is higher. And the people who get kicked into the state and local or who get kicked in the AMT are very often people that have big state and local deductions because that's like the tax dodge that they've got.
Right.
And so, which of course is not really a tax dodge. And so it's just a needless complexity of the code. And one of the three main non-negotiables for President Trump from the beginning has been to simplify. And, we would have simplified the AMT altogether just with the bigger standard deduction and the elimination of the state and local income tax deduction. That would probably move most people off of the AMT along with some of the other things that we've done, taking away the special loopholes. But just to be clear, they also eliminate the thing. Once you've got it sort of on the ropes, you might as well kill it, and that's what they did. But at the margin, the cost of killing it wasn't so big because they had already removed a lot of the loopholes that were going to put people on the AMT in the first place. And but again, to be in a world where you have to do your taxes twice and pay whatever's higher, that's a crazy, crazy world, and it's great to get rid of that thing.
So part of the logic of what you're doing is to simplify the code and write it in such a way this new tax plan would encourage more people not to itemize, right? That would just take the standard deductions because they'll be better off.
Right.
And only
that's right.
So explain that, because only about 30% of people itemize now, right? So that will go down.
Yeah, that's right. And it'll go down dramatically. It'll be about a third of that probably when all is said and done, although there's still some parts that are moving. It's just as soon as you're itemizing, then you got to keep your receipts and you got to keep track of this thing or that thing, and you got lots of forms to fill out. And if all these itemized deductions could just be given to you as a standard deduction that was big enough to cover most people, then the record keeping challenges of taxes would go down dramatically. And so it's a really good reform to do that.
Okay, I've only got a couple more minutes. We're with Kevin Hassett. He is the chairman of the President's Council of Economic Advisors in the White House. He was confirmed in September. He's an economist, obviously. Kevin, I've only got a couple more minutes. I've got one question here from one of our listeners that says, John, could you please ask Mr. Chairman to talk a little bit more about the overtime deal that would affect me, Steve, in Chesapeake?
Oh, yeah. So I think that what he's just talking about is that if you have a lower marginal tax rate, then you get to keep more of your money. And so by doing away with all these loopholes and the state and local deduction and so on, then we're making it so that if you work an extra hour, you get time and a half, then you get to keep a lot more of that.
Right. So
because it's not going to, right? Yeah, because it's not really going to change your property tax or something, right? To work an extra hour, but it will give you more money.
Right, because under the old plan, if you made over a certain amount of money, you would go into a higher tax bracket. Now those have been collapsed down, so you're going to have the incentive because you're still at the lower bracket. Final question: I'm going to ask the same thing I asked at the White House press briefing, Kevin, on Friday. You had mentioned something that really was riveting to me. You said when you did your analysis, an average family is going to see a benefit of $4,000 cash when this thing is said and done. I mean, that's a big number. With that, for the layman, walk us through how you get to that number for the layman.
Sure. And the way we do it is that a lot of other countries have done exactly what we're doing right now. And we just looked at, the average experience for the typical worker in some other country that had a tax plan like this and estimated what it was, on average. And in 3 to 5 years, it's typical for a family to get a pay increase of about $4,000.
So if you take the increased wages and the less taxes you're going to pay, you come out with about $4,000. And also, as you said, if you grow the economy at the clip that you mentioned, you're going to be able to make up that $110 billion annually. And I just want to remind everyone, again, Kevin, that during the Reagan tax years, that the government budget numbers grew from $517 billion annually in 1980 to $909 billion in 88. That's a big increase. Don't you agree?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's right. That's right. Well, so I'm getting waved to, John.
Okay, I got to go.
Off,
happy holidays, sir.
And I hope I can come back soon.
Thank you for being with us, Kevin Hassett,
thanks.
with us. Have a happy Thanksgiving. The chairman of the President's Council on Economic Advisors, John Fredericks Radio Network. We hope he's answered some of your questions on the tax plan, which has to get passed. And I think the way he summed up the debt, which seems to be some people's question, is we're talking about over a 10-year period, an additional $110 billion. The government budget numbers show that the tax receipts expanded from the Reagan tax cut from $517 billion in 1980 to $909 billion in 88. So it grew dramatically under Reagan. So it's inconceivable to me that you're not going to make up $110 billion with this tax cut. Inconceivable. So I don't know where Mike and these other people are getting their numbers, but these numbers are pretty clear.